The topic for this week is cold calling, and before we get to talking about cold calling, I want to actually just take a step back and review a couple things we've talked about in previous chapters of the Smart Sales System. So in chapter 2, we talked about some core concepts, and I just want to go through those real quick because everything we talk about regarding cold calling is going to be designed to accommodate those core concepts. So the first core concept was that I recommend that you try to understand the prospect. If you want them to understand you and why to buy your product, first start by trying to understand them. And one of the first things to understand about the prospect is that you can just assume that they're extremely busy. When you're cold calling them, just assume, whether they answer the phone or not, that the person that you're calling is extremely busy. And by the way, that's not a reason to not call them, but it can impact what you say. It can impact how you treat them. It can impact what you are mentally thinking when they don't answer your phone call or when they try to get rid of you with an objection. So it's just one of the things to understand about them. The other thing to understand about the prospect is that your prospects are getting sold to a lot. And the higher you go in an organization, the more they're getting sold to, meaning you're cold calling them just in the same way that lots of other salespeople are cold calling them. Lots of other salespeople are emailing them. And that's something to definitely understand about the prospect. Because the person that you're calling is getting called by so many other people, you want to do everything you can to not sound like a salesperson that's trying to sell something. Because the prospects get sold to a lot, they might start to get a little annoyed and a little guarded when the next salesperson comes knocking on the door or the phone is ringing. So you can improve your cold calling by trying to minimize how much you sound like a salesperson. We're going to talk about that today. One way to not sound like a salesperson is to not focus so much on yourself. Salespeople often, this is my product, this is the company I work for, and they focus on the interests of trying to sell their product to the prospect. We want you to flip that upside down and focus more on the prospect and not on you. One way to focus more on the prospect and less on you is to ask good questions, and we'll talk about a lot about that here today. And it's important to understand that you're calling a prospect hoping to sell your product at some point, maybe on that call or maybe somewhere down the road. But it's important to know that when that prospect answers your call, they're most likely not sitting at their desk thinking about buying what you sell. It's not to say you can't sell to them. It's not to say that they don't need what you sell, but it's important to be aware that the probability of them thinking about buying what you sell is very low. And that's important to know because that can impact what you say and what you're thinking about when you cold call. And because they're not thinking about what you sell, and because a cold call is very short, there's really not enough time to sell your product, even if they were needing your product at the exact same time that you call. So the cold call is not a great place to sell your product. So you should focus more on trying to sell the meeting instead of selling the product. And just to review what we talked about last week before we talk about cold calling, we talked about the sales process, with the initial contact being the first time you reach out or speak to someone, the next step being the meeting of when you actually have a real conversation, either an appointment or some sort of call with the prospect. And then the third step would be some sort of presentation, which is talking about how you can help them. And so we're talking about cold calling here today, which is the very first step. So we're going to drill into the initial contact if you're doing that through a cold call. And the goals of the cold call are not to sell the product. They are to pre-qualify the prospect and to build a little bit of interest. Not enough interest to where the prospect wants to buy from you, but enough interest so we can get the prospect to move to that second step of a meeting. And the close is not the product. I just mentioned that. We're not trying to sell the product, we're trying to sell the meeting. The process I'm going to share with you is going to try to keep you within a 2 to 5 minute window. And I mentioned a core concept of trying to focus more on the prospect than on you. We're going to try to focus 80% of the cold call on the prospect, or 80% of the initial contact on the prospect, and 20% on you, and I'll show you what that looks like. And the central piece of the cold call are going to be some questions we're going to ask, and we can ask our pain questions or current environment questions. I'm going to show you basically a cold call process that you can use for that initial contact step. And this is kind of an example of how this is the smart sales system, with system being the key word there. This is one example of part of the system. So I'm going to show you a process here today. It's 7 steps, and I'm going to go through each step at a time. And these are steps that you can implement and adopt and systematize how you cold call. Now the steps are on the left side, and like I said, I'm going to go through those one at a time. It's important to know that the steps aren't necessarily laid out in chronological order, meaning we start at the top and we want to finish at the bottom and go straight through. More so, this is an outline or modular framework that you should bounce around depending on what the prospect says or how they respond to you. And I'll teach you the logic for how to bounce around in these different steps here today. And so the first step is to basically just open the call. And this might even be the most difficult step, or probably the step where most salespeople go wrong. And one way that they go wrong is a lot of salespeople will start out the call by asking the prospect a question like, "How are you doing today?" Or, "Is this a good time to talk?" "Are you busy right now?" "Do you have a minute to talk?" And I think all of these are bad, or I recommend trying to avoid all of these. I think the most common one is a salesperson trying to manufacture rapport by calling up someone that they've never spoken to before and saying, "How are you doing today?" And when I get calls from salespeople all the time, and I'm a nice guy, so they say, "How are you doing today?" And then I say, "I'm pretty good." And then I'll ask them back, "How are you doing? How are you doing?" And they say something pretty good. Maybe they might even try to say something to where they're trying to be nice, or tell me about how their day's going. And at this point, what's basically happening is we're wasting time. You're calling someone. Remember, I said we can assume they're busy. You only have 2 to 5 minutes to work with, and here we are having this meaningless, really empty exchange with someone we don't even know. I throw this rule out the window if you've spoken at least one time. If you've spoken one time and you're calling them back, open up with, "How are you doing?" Because you know each other. You've spoken before. "Hey, how are you doing? How's your day going so far?" Fine. But if this is the very first time speaking, I advise don't try to manufacture rapport, waste time. And the most important thing is that any of these questions make you sound like a salesperson, which immediately triggers the guardedness of the prospect. The other thing that a lot of these questions do, except for the first one, but the rest of them, they're a weak frame of mind. "Is this a good time to talk? Are you busy right now?" If you had a bag of money and you were trying to find who the bag of money belonged to, would you ask them, "Are you busy right now?" If you saw someone in a park and you were going to go walk up to them, would you say, "Excuse me, are you busy right now?" Would you ask that before you before you start to see if the bag of money is theirs? You would not, because you know how valuable what you have is. It's when you start to worry that the person is too busy for you that you begin to sound weak, and that you're a salesperson trying to push a product instead of someone trying to see if that finds the person that needs what they sell. And that might sound contradictory, because I just mentioned we should assume that the prospect's busy. In fact, we know the prospect's busy, so we shouldn't ask, "Are you busy right now?" So let me tell you what I would replace any of those questions with, which is, this is the introduction I'd recommend, which is, hello Mary, this is Michael Halper calling from Sales Scripter. Have I caught you in the middle of anything?" So I want you to replace any of those questions with, "Have I caught you in the middle of anything?" And this small change can drastically improve your ability to open calls and get calls established, because, for one thing, "Have I caught you in the middle of anything?" respects the prospect's time. Before you just barge in, picture yourself barging in a coworker's office that's sitting there working on a deadline where they have a proposal that needs to be done by lunch, and you just barge in and start talking to them and sit down in the chair in their office. That would be rude, and you would have misread the situation. Even if it's just a friend or coworker, the proper thing to probably do would be to peek your head in the office and say, hey, are you in the middle of anything? And then that checks the temperature of whether you can proceed or if you should hold off by talking about what you want to talk about. If the prospect answers this with some sort of no, I'm fine, or I have a couple minutes, this question helps you to buy the 2 to 5 minutes you need for that initial contact cold call step. So if you don't ask this question, you might feel rushed. If you ask this question and get approval to move forward, you will feel less rushed and you will have the window of time to proceed with the cold call process that I'm going to share with you. The other thing about this is that it's very casual and friendly. When you say, hello, Mr. Helper, how are you doing today? You sound more formal and can start to sound like a salesperson trying to sell something. When you ask this, you actually decrease someone's guardedness because you sound more friendly, more casual. You might begin to actually sound like someone that they already know or that they're familiar with. And it's almost a pattern interrupt. If all of other salespeople are saying, hello, how are you doing today? How are you doing today? How are you doing today? And then you call up and you say, have I caught you in the middle of anything? It takes the prospect out of that auto response phase where they'll trigger the automatic objection, and it takes them into where this is what a pattern interrupt concept is all about, is turning off someone's auto response and actually making them more aware of what's going on. So that's a whole other conversation itself, but something to think about. So that small change addresses a lot of the concepts that we want to worry about here. It helps you to understand the prospect because you're aware that they're busy and you're checking in before you proceed to move forward. It also helps you because you know that the prospects are getting sold to a lot, so you're trying to sound different and not sound like one of those salespeople that's trying to reach out to them, which that small change will decrease the level of guardedness that you experience right out of the gate. Now, where to go right after you attempt to open the call kind of depends on how the prospect responds. So if you get a response with anything that sounds like, yeah, yes, I'm okay, or yeah, I'm in the middle of something, but it's okay, or I'm fine, or they could even ask you a question like, which basically they're not saying they're not in the middle of anything, but they're saying, well, what is it in regards to, or it depends, why are you calling? If you get anything like that, you proceed to the next step, so basically what you can see there, if you get the green light, or if you get an objection being what's this in regards to, which is basically a prospect trying to get rid of you, that's a screening question. So if you get a green light or a screening question, you still proceed to the same place, which is the next step in the process, which is state the purpose of your call. Because the stating the purpose of the call is something we're going to talk about that in a second. It's something you'll do whether or not you get the 2 to 5 minutes, or if they're asking what is this in regards to, because that's the answer to what it's in regards to. But there is a chance that you might get a response that looks something like this, where they say, yeah, I am in the middle of something, meaning there's a fire going on and they don't have time to even deal with you, or yeah, I'm busy right now, or I'm not available. If you get any response from the prospects with something like that, you can respond with, oh, okay, no problem at all. Listen, I can be really brief, or I can call you back later today or another time, which works better for you. Or you can respond with, oh, okay, what's the best time for me to call you back? When you ask that, there's a good chance they'll tell you when to call them back. They also may just say, oh, it's fine, what do you have? Because when they're aware that you're going to call back, they may just try to knock it out with whatever you're trying to call about and address it, and you get the green light to move forward. But let's say we're moving forward to the next step in the process, which is state the purpose of the call. Remember, you're not trying to sell the product. You're not even trying to close for the next step in the process yet. Right now, you're just trying to establish the call. Well, the most logical thing, if you're trying to establish the call, the most logical thing to do at that point is to explain why you're calling. So if you're in the real product selling salesperson mindset, which is I only care about my own stuff and I'm only thinking about that, then the purpose of your call might be that you're calling to introduce yourself or your company. You're calling to schedule a meeting or appointment. You're calling to learn about the prospect's needs. You're calling to share details about the product that you offer. You're calling to sell the product to the prospect. Not to say that you would say any of these, but those are probably the real reason for your call. And my advice is to not state anything close to any of these, because these will all make you look like a salesperson trying to sell something. And as soon as you start to look like that, you'll trigger guardedness, and the prospect will begin to shut down and block you out with an objection. So you want to avoid anything that sounds like that. Now, so I'm going to give you three different things that you can share as the purpose of your call. And so the first one is you could share your value points building block. And so that might look something like this. Well, great. Well, the reason for my call is I work with sales managers and I help them to decrease the amount of time it takes to train new sales hires. And so that's a value point. By the way, I have here value point 1, 2, 3. You could share one value point or you could share 3. The real determining factor there is how long your individual value points are. So if your value points are just a couple words each, you could share a set of them. You know, I help CFOs to decrease costs, to improve order cycle time, and also improve visibility across their operation. So that's 3 different value points, all shared as kind of one. If your value points are like a whole explanation, you might only want to share one. But you could share that basically as the reason for your call. Now, it might not really make logical sense, because it's almost incomplete, but you're basically telling the prospect, this is what I do, and this is why I'm calling, because I'm trying to see if you're if you're in the group of people that need that. And so another option for that is to share your pain points building block, which is very similar. It just would be different bullet points. Instead of talking about improvements, you're basically sharing a couple problems. So what that might look like is, have I caught you in the middle of anything? What's this in regards to? The reason for my call is I work with CFOs and I help them to improve the challenges of long order wait times, high inventory costs. So basically, I'm just inserting their 2 pain points. But you basically can insert your own pain points there. But that's basically the purpose of the call, is that I solve that problem, and that's why I'm reaching out. Another version of that is kind of the value points, but sharing it as a customer example with the name drop building block, which is something like, have I caught you in the middle of anything? No, I have 2 minutes. Okay, great. Well, the reason for my call is we worked with XYZ Corp, and we helped them to streamline their new sales hire training process. This ultimately helped them to decrease new sales hire onboarding time from 3 months to 6 weeks, and it also decreased their sales staff turnover at the same time. So basically, I'm just inserting that template there with what's in the brackets, and basically that just opens the call with a quick example. Now that will make a little bit more sense when we go to the next step of the process, but that example right there, if we go back to the core concepts, what we just did there addressed a lot of the things that we're trying to accomplish. We understand the prospect because we're not talking about the product, we're talking about the problems of theirs or the improvements that they would be interested in. So instead of saying, oh, we sell this or we provide this, I'm talking about what the prospect cares about. I know the prospect is busy, so I'm being extremely efficient by just sharing the value prop instead of getting in the product and company details. Prospects get sold to a lot, and what I recommend you do there, you're going to sound different from most other salespeople, so this will also help to decrease guardedness, and we're focusing on them. We're not talking about our product yet. From there, it's pretty easy. We can move to the next step of the process. Not a big decision to make here. The next step of the process is to deliver a sales takeaway. And a sales takeaway is basically an expression of doubt whether or not your product fits with the prospect. So there's different times where you'd want to do a takeaway. We'll drill into how to do the takeaway in detail later. But at the beginning of a call, you could do a kind of a quick takeaway by saying something like this. And by the way, you deliver this right after your value points, your pain points, your name drop. So it would look something like this. I help sales managers to improve their lead generation efforts, but I don't know if that's an area that you want to improve, and that's why I'm calling you with a question or two. So right there, that it's like a push-pull effect. I'm explaining what I could potentially help them with, and then I'm taking it away. So that does something really powerful. It creates a little curiosity. It also decreases guardedness, but there's some other versions here that you might use. If you're talking about pain points, you might say, I don't know if you're concerned about any of those areas, and that's why I'm calling with a question or two. If you share a name drop example, you might say something like, I don't know if I can help you in the same way that I've helped other businesses, but that's why I'm calling with a question or two, or I don't even know if you're the right person for me to speak with or not. The real magic in doing this at the very beginning of the call is that the prospect is still maybe thinking, I'm busy, and who is this person? Are they going to start to try to push something on me? And so this takes all of that away. And it does a few really powerful things, but it addresses the fact that most salespeople won't do this. They're going to push. They're in the mindset of, I have to sell my product. You're going to love what I sell. I want to talk to you about what I sell. And this does the exact opposite. It's saying, hey, I don't know if you need what I sell. So, and it shows that you care about their interest. Their interest is if they're going to buy from you, their interest is to buy products that they need, not waste money on stuff they don't need. So when you express doubt that they need what you sell, you're focusing on their interests and not yours, because your interests are to sell the product. It's the product pusher that doesn't express the concern or doubt that is focusing on their own interests, and you're not doing that. From there, you can move to the next step, which is to basically pre-qualify the prospect. And pre-qualify, we're going to drill into what qualifying is in great detail, all by itself in a module. But basically, qualifying is to determine how good of a fit overall the prospect is in terms of needing what you sell, being able to purchase, having the money, having the power to purchase, and whatnot. So if we add the pre in front of the qualify, basically we're not trying to determine is this person a decision maker? Does this person have budget? You don't care about all that, because really all you're trying to do at this point, by the way, you've established the call. So you're not trying to establish the call now. You're trying to determine, does it make sense to keep talking to this person? Makes sense for not only for them to talk to you, but does it even make sense for you to keep talking to this person? For example, if you sell a product that's for couples that are expecting a baby, you would not want to waste your time talking to someone that's not married, or to a couple that is not planning on having any children. So if you can identify that, you can then save yourself time. So that's kind of what pre-qualifying is all about. Is just determining, are we even in the general area of it making sense to keep talking? And so questions you can ask for that, your pain questions are excellent questions for that. So if I help to make onboarding new sales hires and training new sales hires easier, then a good question to ask would be, how important is it for you to decrease that ramp up time for new sales hires? Or how concerned are you about the turnover you have for sales hires? Or how concerned are you about the performance of your new sales hires? Are they able to generate leads? So those are pain questions, and this is a great place to ask those, because if all of the pain that you help to fix doesn't exist, then it might not make sense. That's kind of, you're getting in the same area as selling something for couples that are expecting a baby, and you might identify you're talking to a couple that's not planning on having any children. So you can identify that you're starting to head in that area. Another set of questions, we talked about these before, are your current environment questions, which are basically just feeling out what the prospect is doing in the area that you have something to offer. For example, if you sell office products, a current environment question would be, how often do you purchase office supplies? Do you have a contract with a vendor Are you having office supplies automatically delivered? What does your inventory look like? So those aren't really around pain. Those are around what's going on in the current environment. So depending on whether you ask pain questions or current environment questions is maybe up to what you sell in your particular situation. Or it could be you might start out with one, and depending on how the prospect responds, then you flip over to another. But now keep in mind, you only have 2 to 5 minutes to work with. So I'm giving you, you might have a long list of questions. You only have time to ask between 2 to 4 questions. What these questions do is they help us with not sounding like a salesperson, because the salesperson's not going to ask a whole lot of questions. They're going to want to spend the cold call talking about what they sell. And the main question is are you interested, or do you need what I sell? The questions are also good at helping you to focus on the prospect and not on you. Because again, if you're focused on you, you're wanting to talk about your product, you're asking good questions, you're learning about the prospect. And again, the best salesperson is the one that asks the best questions, and great questions asked are your pain questions and current environment questions on the cold call. Now this is where we can begin to bounce around in different directions, because you're going to ask you ask one question, and hopefully you're going to get one answer. And after each answer, each question, you could go in a different direction. To help figuring out and simplifying what directions you can go, there's 3 different temperatures or categories of that you could label on the prospect's answer to your question. So a hot response is basically you ask a pain question or a current environment question, and the prospect gives you the perfect response, meaning the answer shows that they need what you sell. Think of this as being the equivalent of going to a casino, a slot machine, and you pull the lever and you get like 777 and the sirens are going off, right? Now the second type of category is a neutral response. This is where the prospect says, things are okay, or I don't know, or it's not a great answer, but it's also not a no, we're good, or everything's great. And the cold response would be no, we're good and everything's great. An example of that might be, you're asking about like some sort of system, and they say, no, we love it, or they just purchased what you sell. So it's just very cold. Now, what basically every answer to each of your questions, you should be able to immediately, this shouldn't be a big thought process. You should just be able to feel and identify, oh, that was a good response or a bad response or neutral. But basically, depending on what type of answer you get, impacts where you go next. If you get what we call a hot response, the prospect needs what you sell, you can skip the rest of the script, and move forward to starting to try to close the prospect. So you'll see here the arrow doesn't actually go all the way down to the close. It goes to the section right before the close, which is basically product and company details. So this is where I'm going to show you what that step looks like in a couple steps, but that you can look at as kind of like your pre-close step, because this is where you start to talk about you, and you would want to share some information about you, just enough right before you go for the close. So you can skip ahead. If you get a neutral response, you have 2 choices. One is you could ask another question. So if you have 3 pain questions, and question 1 is a neutral response, well, you could ask pain question number 2. And so you're not moving on to the next step. But if you've asked a couple questions, or if you've just asked one question, you could move forward to the next step, which is the pain points. If you get a cold response, you could treat a neutral response and a cold response in the same way, which is either ask another question or move on to the next step. It's really the hot response that gives you the opportunity to skip ahead, because they're basically giving you what you're looking for, so you can just pounce on that and try to close. Now, if we move to the next step, which is sharing pain points, your hope is that with asking questions, you found out that it was a fit or there was a need, right? That's your hope. Now, if that's not successful, you can start to share pain points, and this is less optimum, but it's kind of like you're starting to almost give up a little. This is like your last resort or last position to hold before you start to sort of concede or walk away. But this is where instead of asking questions, you're basically sharing the problems that you help to fix. So, if you ask a couple questions, they're like, no, we're pretty good, no, we're pretty good. Then you could move forward to say, oh, okay, well, I tell you what, when I talk with other VPs of sales, they often say that the inside sales team isn't generating enough leads. The turnover is really high, and that's impacting their sales results, and they're not able to hit their long-term sales objectives. I just want to check in with you. Are you good in all those areas, or any of those areas concerns that you have? So basically, I've given up on asking questions, and now I'm just telling them, these are the problems that I fix. Are you saying you don't have any of those problems? So a good analogy here is like if you go to the doctor might ask you if you have the symptom, or poke you here, poke you there, right? But if you keep saying, no, I'm fine, no, that doesn't hurt, then the doctor might take a step back and say, I don't know, you might be okay, might not be anything to worry about. Let me just see. And he or she might just rattle off a list of stuff and say, can we just say you don't have any of those, or do you have any of those? So it's like a sort of your last attempt. Now, where you can go from the pain points is if they say let's say they say, well, yeah, we could be better in that area. So you basically find pain, you move forward to the next step, which is kind of your pre-close step, which is to talk about yourself and your product. And so the way you might do that is you might say, well, based on what you said, it might make sense for us to talk in more detail, and then you begin to talk about your product or service. Now, you could always go back. If you don't uncover pain, or you don't get a great response to pain points, but you still have the prospect, engaged on the call, you could always go back to a pain question that you didn't ask. So just showing you some examples here of how you can balance between these sections. You could also begin to walk away. So if you've asked a handful of questions, and when I say handful, I mean maybe 3, 4, you've shared some pain points, and you've said, you have any of these, and they say, no, we're good. You could begin to walk away, which is say something like, I don't know, it sounds like you guys are doing pretty good over there. Maybe it doesn't make sense for us to talk too much, and you begin to walk away. Although, if you're one of those just like, I'm not going to give up, even if you've given it your all, you could still proceed to the product and company step, meaning you've asked a couple questions, no pain. You shared some pain examples, no pain. If you don't really, truly don't want to give up, you could just still move forward to the next section, which is where you're going to start to talk about you. Now remember, we're trying to operate in a 2 to 5 minute window here, and we're trying to put 80% on the prospect and 20% on you. So what this might look like is in a 5-minute call, the first, let's say 3 to 4 minutes, we've been talking about the prospect by asking questions. Now we're going to talk about us. And by the way, this is the opposite from the product selling salesperson, where they usually talk about the product right out of the gate when they're talking about the purpose of the call, or they're opening the call. I work for this company, this is what we sell, this is what we do. And then the question is, are you guys looking at purchasing this? Something like that. Here, we're getting to it at the end. So we focused more on the prospect than on us. And now we're going to share just a few details. And so here I have the product, basically the product building block that we showed in a previous training module. And I'm not saying that you would share all of these individual points. This is just a list of different things that you could talk about when talking about your stuff and what you sell to try to trigger interest. And again, we're just trying to trigger not enough interest so the prospect buys, but enough interest so that we can close the prospect After you share some brief product and company details, and probably want to spend about a minute on that step, we can move forward to the close. We're at the initial contact. So the goal is to sell the meeting. I already talked about that. The goal is not to sell the product. The goal is, are you interested in having a conversation? I want to point out, even if you are going to try to sell the product there on the phone, this is the end of the cold call. If you're going to continue to talk to the prospect for 10 minutes and get into details about your product, you're moving beyond the cold call. So if you get the green light to keep going, you're moving beyond this process that I'm showing you. So this process is just the cold call and just to establish the conversation, basically to get to the meeting. So to close for the meeting, here's what the cold call close might look like. So you basically shared some information about your product. This is what we do. This is how it works. Here's an example of another company we worked with. But you know what? Listen, I've called you out of the blue. I'm not sure if this is the best time to get into all these details. Are you interested in talking about this in more detail? What we could do is I could put a 15, 20-minute meeting on your calendar, either later today or later in the week, and I can share you some examples of how we help other VPs of sales to improve this and improve that. Or are you available to keep talking about this right now? I mean, I'm free. I just want to be courteous to your time. So what I'd like to share with you is about a 20-minute conversation. If you're free right now, I could send you a meeting link, and just a couple slides I wanted to share with you. So that's an example of using that outline right there for the close. Now, at this point, sometimes you might close and set an appointment. It's also very likely that your close might not be successful even using this process that I'm very proud of and that I think will help you. You still might get prospects that say, actually, I'm not interested, or I'm not available, or we don't have budget right now, or we already used someone for that. It's very possible for you to get objections at this point in the call. Basically, you can get objections really at any point, but the most common places are either at the beginning of the call or at the end of the call when you try to schedule the meeting. Let's put the objections to the side for now. If they say, oh, yeah, okay, I'm interested in talking in more detail. So your close is successful, then basically the process is to confirm the meeting, send out an invite, send out the time, an email with the date and time and whatnot. If you get objections, the process gives you a framework to keep the call going. So basically, you can go back to your questions. So if they say, we already used someone today, so it probably doesn't make sense to talk too much, you can respond with, and by the way, we'll talk about objection responses in full detail later, but the response to that could be, oh yeah, hey, I understand, and listen, we're not trying to call you up to get you to switch and make any changes, but I'm just curious, do you mind if I ask who you guys are using today? So that question, do you mind if I ask who are you using today, is a current environment question. So that's an example of going from the close back up to through the process to the pre-qualified question. You could also go back, so if they say, I'm not interested, then you could go back to the pain points. Maybe you skipped the pain points earlier on. You went straight from the pre-qualified to the product and to the close, and then the prospect says, I think we're okay right now. Then you could go back to the pain points and say, oh yeah, hey, listen, I understand. But I'm just curious, when I work with a lot of inside sales directors, they often don't have visibility to what their inside sales reps are doing on each call. Is that a concern for you at all? So what I did there is I just went back up to share a pain point and then confirmed, is that something they're concerned with? And what you're doing there, and the initial thing you're doing is you try to close and they try to shut you down and you weren't successful. So instead of just ending the call and going away, you're at least keeping the call going. So that's the initial thing you're trying to do. But it's not that you're trying to keep the call going and throwing up a Hail Mary. This process is actually giving you something to work with. So when you ask your question, you're going to get an answer, and that answer can then be labeled in the hot, neutral, or cold. And if you get a hot or even a neutral, so if you get a hot or neutral, you could use that to justify your close again. So if you get a hot response to your next question, you could go back for a close again and say, oh, well, see, that's why it might make sense for us to talk more, because if you're concerned about that, that's the type of thing we help with. And so are you sure you don't want to put a meeting on the calendar? It doesn't have to be this week. We're not going anywhere. I mean, we could meet next month. But if you have that concern, then it might make sense to talk. Now, even if you get a neutral response with a prospect saying, I'm not sure, which isn't really hot or cold, you could even use that to close, which is to say, oh, well, if you're not sure and you're not sure what's going on in that particular area, then it might make sense for us to talk in more detail, because we have a lot of knowledge about that particular area, and we might be able to help you to figure out what's going on, and it might make sense for us to talk in more detail. So that's just an example of a neutral response leading to a close attempt. You don't want to drag out a call if someone's just giving you objection after objection, but ideally if you can try to get around objections 2 to 3 times before you kind of like accept it and walk away, then you should be able to sleep well at night. And if you do that on every call, then your performance should be, over a large sample, you should be performing at a decent level, or at least you're not giving up and giving in and complying too much. Applying that to an individual cold call is, you might want to, if you aren't able to close, you might want to try to ask a couple more questions and keep the call going, and maybe try to close 2 to 3 times before walking away. So that close logic there kind of addresses the core concepts that that prospects aren't in buying mode when you call them up, most likely. So if you're going to call them up and try to sell them, there's a low probability for a match, right? You're calling to try to sell, they're not buying at that particular moment, so the odds of trying to make that match is a low probability. And if it's not a match but you try to force it, meaning like squeezing a square peg in a round hole, then you know how successful that will be over a period of a large sample of calls. So what this process does is it complies better with the prospect not being in buying mode, and also with the cold call really not being enough time to build interest to sell the product. So it's just really focusing on, you're calling them. Your goal of the cold call is to start the conversation, to sell the meeting, and that the close step of the process helps you with all of that. So that's the process, and hopefully that will help you to not only improve your cold calling, hopefully it'll help to simplify how you view cold calling and make cold calling easier, and ultimately that should help you to decrease stress and make your job easier and make you enjoy your job more. And hopefully if any of those things happen, if not all of those things happen, you will likely sell more